Hi there, and we're live. Welcome to this latest episode of Totally Unscripted. My name's Martin Hoxie, and I'm joined, as usual, by Steve Webster, and also delighted to have Ben Collins here joining us as well. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Martin. So thanks very much for having me on the show. I've been a watcher for quite a while, so it's nice actually to be here as a guest today. So thanks.
So Ben, you've produced a ton of stuff around Google Apps Script and particularly around Google Sheets. Your background, for people that don't know, is in terms of data analyst, and you're also a trainer as well. And it's rather fortuitous timing that this episode of Totally Unscripted, which is focusing on Data Studio, comes the day after Google announced that Data Studio is out of beta. So I think that's great that the product has matured to the point where Google are happy to remove the beta sticker. And hopefully this will mean that there'll be floods of people as well wanting to get their teeth into Data Studio. And what no better way than a quick tour from you, Ben?
Yeah, sure. So just to introduce myself a little bit as well, I came from a sort of finance and accounting background doing Excel and VBA, and that was sort of my route into data and technology. And I really liked the coding and the data analysis side of things more than the accounting. So kind of moved into that area, picked up G Suite and AppScript and Google Sheets. It's about 4 or 5 years ago now, and gradually I've just sort of moved entirely into that area, freelancing now and creating courses around that content and the blog. And yeah, like you said, so Data Studio was launched about 2 years ago, and so it's been improved dramatically since then. So every time I load up Data Studio, it seems to change a little bit, but I think finally now they've got the core product set, and it's great to see it out of beta now because there's a lot of momentum with the product, and I think it's going to go to sort of just have a lot of new users now and really grow in terms of the community as well as the people using it. So it's great to see. And today we're going to talk about Data Studio connectors, and we'll get into what they are in a minute. And they're all about bringing the data, your data into Data Studio. So what I'll do is I'll jump across to some slides I've got, Martin, and
Sure,
just
yeah,
talk through that, and we'll go from there. So let me see if screen share.
So while Ben is setting that up, we've got the YouTube chat going. So if you've got any questions for Ben, feel free to put those in there, or you can just ping me on Twitter as well, mhoxie, and we'll pick those up at the end.
Okay, great. So can you see the screen now, Martin and Steve? So we're going to talk about Data Studio community connectors, and so we'll just talk briefly about what they are just to set the scene. So for those who are not familiar, Data Studio is a dashboard reporting tool, and on the left-hand side here you can see a little screenshot of just an example MailChimp dashboard. And what Data Studio allows you to do is visualize data from your web APIs and from your Google services in this really slick, easy to use dashboard with a really clean, easy to use UX, almost a little bit like a Google Sheets. You've got the menus across the top, and you create new files, copy them, all that sort of stuff, and you just drag and drop charts in there, so you can make your dashboard reports really, really quickly, and they look really, really professional, very easy sharing, very secure, all that good Google stuff. And then the connectors, which is what we're specifically going to talk about today, because that's all the AppScript stuff, is a standalone AppScript file, which stands in between fits between your API and Data Studio, and it builds that pipeline between your web API, which let's just use the MailChimp example. So I use MailChimp to send emails out to my list and to manage all the campaigns and things, and so I have a lot of data in MailChimp. But you don't get very sophisticated reporting through MailChimp. So what you can do is build this little AppScript file, this connector program, and then pipe your data through into Data Studio, and then you can totally build your own bespoke custom dashboards, which you can share with people and that good stuff. So in a nutshell, what happens is if I'm the user of the Data Studio dashboard, I will say drag and drop a chart onto into my dashboard. That sends a request to my connector file, which then processes that, calls the API, and gets the data back from the API. Then does some data wrangling to transform that data from the raw API JSON into the format that Data Studio needs, and then sends that back to Data Studio. And then lo and behold, your charts there showing with your data from your web API. So as Martin said, it's come out of beta now. So and I think there's already 500 connections now to different web APIs. But if you want to build, a lot of them are paid and maybe don't quite do precisely what you want, so you can still totally valid to build your own. Or if you have a web service that doesn't have a connector built yet, you might want to go and build one. Some are open source as well. And and they're really they're not too difficult. There's a lot of framework, so that they follow there's sort of a set pattern for how the file's structured. And obviously they can get more complex as the connectors get more complex, but in terms of the bare bones and the first demo I'll show you, it's pretty straightforward. So
in terms of the request, you mentioned that when you drop a chart in, it will send a request and get data. What kind of refresh does it do? Is it when the browser with the Data Studio dashboard refreshes, it will request new data?
Yeah, if you refresh your browser, it would send another request. There's a refresh button inside of Data Studio that you can refresh your data with, and if you go and make any changes to the chart or drop a new chart in or that kind of thing, it will send a new one through. So yeah, that's how it works at the moment. And so I really tried to strip it right back to what are the sort of building blocks in every connector, and it really there's four. I've got 5 things here, but really numbers 2 and 3 are the same. You have a configuration function, which is when the user first connects to Data Studio with this connector, whether there's any kind of setup they need to do. So maybe they need to enter their their username or some sort of maybe an API key or a tag they want to search for that specific, to sort of narrow the data down to their use case. So that's the configuration, and I'll show you that in action later on.
Sure.
Then numbers 2 and 3 are all about setting up the schema, which is like the blueprint for your data that you're going to send to Data Studio. So Data Studio knows, okay, these are the fields that I'm getting back from this connector, and these are the dimensions I have, these are the metrics I have, and this one is numeric, this one's a string, this one's a geographic field, that kind of stuff. So it knows when the data arrives, it knows how to parse it and how to show it. So that's what the numbers 2 and 3 are all about, the schema. And then you have the get data function, which is really the heart of your Data Studio connector file. And what that does is it gets the request from Data Studio, which says, hey, I want to draw a chart, line chart, which has a time along the x-axis and amount up the y-axis, and I want those 2 fields, please. So that request comes into get data, and get data says, okay, I'm going to go and grab the data from the API, and then send just the data that you asked for back to Data Studio, along with the schema, those 2 fields from my schema, back to Data Studio. And so get data is typically the function where you do a lot of the coding that's specific to your connector. So the configuration of schema, you kind of follow a framework. It's just about setting things up, and then the get data is where you say, okay, well, this is where I need to do all my data wrangling and call my API and do my error handling. And then finally, the 5th sort of mandatory function, if you like, is the get authentication type, this get auth type. And on this very simple one I'm going to show you, it's just none. So there's no authentication. So we just say none and just specify that. But you can do OAuth authentication, and what you would do is you'd specify OAuth in this get auth type, and then you have to add in a few extra functions and the OAuth app script library as well to sort of hook that up. But it's just the same as any OAuth authentication workflow in an add-on, like Steve does and that kind of thing. So that's the very basic things you need in your code.js file. And then the one other thing you need to deploy your connector is your manifest file. And you need to just add in, you'll see this little Data Studio object, where it's basically just the metadata for your Data Studio connector, so that when you try and hook the thing up, Data Studio knows that it's a Data Studio connector and this is the data about it, and then can display that to the user when they first try and use your connector, so that they know that, okay, this is the right connector I was looking for, and this is what it does, and this is, if there's any sometimes there's a template you might put into this, for example, that loads up when it first loads up. So you have to set that manifest file up. But again, you can just do the very basics and then expend it as you need. So I thought what we do is just jump into an actual demo now, rather than me talking away, and try and actually build a little Data Studio connector and see if we can get it to work. Because who doesn't love a live demo, right? And so what I thought would be quite fun would be to try and connect to this one, which is it's called the Open Notify API, and it just returns, you can see the bottom right down here, this little packet of data, which is the current position of the International Space Station, the longitude and latitude, and a timestamp. And so it's a really nice little connector to work with, because it's a fun topic, and also it's pretty easy in terms of the code you need just to pass that when it comes back from the API. And then what we'll do is, when we've set it up, hopefully we'll get to this data screen here when we connect to the connector, where we see our different fields. So we'll have a go. So if you bear with me while I just try and get to the right page now. So it's a standalone app script file that we build for these connectors. So we'll just go into new, and we'll just go and create an app script file. And we'll just clear out the my function one. I'm not going to try and code it all line by line, because that would be a total disaster. So what I'll do is I'll put in those 5 functions that I talked about. Can you see those, Martin? Yep. Okay, great. So we have that configuration one, the 2 set up for the schema, the get data, and the authentication type. So that's really all we need for this one. It really is that simple in this case. And what I'll do now is just drop in a bit of code into each of these in turn to just get things going. So that's configuration. In this case, we don't have any. So we actually just put this in, but it's blank for now. But I'll show you an example, the second demo, where in this configuration params, we might have things like an input box for the user to enter their username or API key or something. So that's what the configuration is for. In this case, we don't actually have any configuration. So let me just get this next one. So the fixed schema is, like I said, it's the blueprint for our data, and so it's an array of these little objects here, with just saying, hey, I'm going to send you through a timestamp field. This first one, for example, I'm looking at. Shall I make that bigger, Martin, or is it okay?
Maybe make it a bit bigger.
Yep.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. So each of these here is a field that I'm going to send into my back to Data Studio. So I have this one called timestamp. That's the name of it that I'm going to refer to in this app script file. Then the label is how the user would see it, what it looks like to them. There's a little description, and then some information about what the data type is, and some semantics there that Data Studio uses to make sure it passes that data correctly. So I have a timestamp one, I have a latitude field, I have the longitude field, I have this one I'm going to create called position, which is going to combine the latitude and longitude for Data Studio. And then I'm also going to just create a more human readable date there for us to be able to use, rather than that timestamp. So that's the schema. It's just, like I said, the blueprint. The next thing we need is just the get schema. In our case, again, it's just very, very simple, is just to return the schema when this is called. So there's nothing extra. Again, this is just a boilerplate piece of code there that we put in for Data Studio. And then the get data is where we start to see the sort of magic happening. So let me just bring this in.
In terms of the get schema function, off the top of your head, are there any examples where you wouldn't just return the schema object? Or
no, I think it's always going to return the object representing the schema.
yeah.
I have seen people set up a namespace for their whole project, and then things start to look a little bit different. But this is one of the required functions for Data Studio, so it has to kind of be in there. It might be more complex. You can actually, since we're talking about this, we've defined a fixed schema here, and we've said, hey, these are the 5 fields. These are the only 5 fields you'll ever see, and this is what they're going to look like. But you can also define, you can have flexible schemas that are sort of generated on the fly. So if you're not quite sure what the data would look like, and that would then look a little bit different. But I have not actually.
Yeah. So the request that comes in might specify that a different schema, or
Yep. And it might sort of and depend on the data that you grab from the API as well. Maybe you could affect it as well. But I've not actually. The ones I've built have always had these fixed schemas. So definitely, what I'm showing you today is definitely an introduction to data connectors. There's certainly quite a lot to it. But it's interesting. It's good stuff. So let me copy in the get data, and we'll just sort of run through that. So I put some loggers in here, so we can, when we run the dashboard, we can come back and look at what the data looks like at each stage. Hopefully that'll be interesting. So there's the URL we're going to call. In our case, it's a nice simple one. And then, so the request here is the request that comes from Data Studio, and that will tell me what fields the user is trying to put into their dashboard. So back to that example when someone was trying to draw a line chart with with a time along the x-axis and an amount up the y-axis, those 2 fields would come back. And all this does essentially is just from the fixed schema is just grab the fields it needs. So rather than sending back the whole fixed schema to Data Studio, we're just going to send back the 2 or the 3 or the 4 fields that we need for our specific request, our specific chart that we're drawing or updating. And that way, obviously, rather than, you're not passing all 200 schema fields back each time. So we just get the schema bit we need. Next, we go and call the API and pass it, and throw an error if something doesn't happen. You'll see that there's specific to Data Studio is this little DS user, just to make sure that shows up to the Data Studio user. So that's, again, it's just how you'd call an API in a regular AppScript project. So nothing sort of different there. And we'll log the response in a moment to go and see what comes back. These 2 lines here are just changing that epoch timestamp into something more readable. Apologies if there's a better way to do that, but it worked for me. And then finally, this is the sort of the data wrangling, and obviously it's very simple in this case. It usually is more complex than this. And in this specific case, what's happening is that API is just returning just one little row of data each time, so it makes it very simple to parse in this case. Normally, you would sort of loop over the response stage as well, so that each row gets pushed into this values array. But that'll make more sense, I think, once I show you some data. But what we're doing here is taking that temporary schema, which was the 2 fields that we selected that for our specific chart right now, and then we go and look at our data, and we just grab the bits of data we want for this specific request and put that into this values array, and then we push the values array into this data array. And when I show you the data that's returned from sent back to Data Studio, that'll make sense what I'm talking about there. So do the data wrangling, and then this is the last piece of boilerplate code here, is that when we return this to Data Studio, we send the data schema back, which is that temporary schema that we set up with just the 2 fields that we're interested in, and then the data that goes with that. So you send tabular data back and the schema telling Data Studio what that data is, essentially, and then it should be able to go ahead and create your charts. So that's the get data function. And the last little bit we need is just the authentication function. And so I can just drop this in. And again, it's very simple in this case. We just say type none. But if we were doing an OAuth one, I think it's just OAuth like that, and then we'd have to add in some extra functions for the OAuth, like the callback and that kind of stuff, and add the library in as well, the same way you normally do with a AppScript file project.
So it's probably worth highlighting at this point that there's no issue using third-party libraries or advanced services.
No, and actually, I don't know if Bruce is with us today, but I used his cache crusher in one project to help me manage the data. And we can talk about caching actually towards the end. I'll briefly mention that as well. So yeah, you can use the libraries. So other thing we need to do is the manifest file. So we come up to view and show manifest file, and at the moment it's just the standard one. And what we'll do is we'll just add in the data studio, little data studio piece we need. So again, we'll just put it at the end here, and that's the bit of code I've added in there. So it's just data studio, and then dropping in the metadata there that goes with data studio. So a name for this thing we're building, a logo, who the company is, the company URL. So I mean, in this case, it's all just me, but you know, you put in you probably have a dedicated support add-on and that kind of things if it's something you're going to publish. We'll save that, and now we'll try and see if it actually see if it runs for us. We'll see what happens if we can get a little chart in Data Studio. So so as you can see, even this very basic one, you know, it's 150 lines of code. And a lot of the length of the project comes just with these schemas. Sometimes, you know, if you have 50 or 100 fields, it gets pretty long. So we come up to publish now, and we deploy from manifest. That's how we do it with these Data Studio connectors. And it brings up the deployment pop-up. And this is where you can create testing and production versions, so that you can sort of have proper version control and make sure that your users are always on a stable one before you roll out new changes. And again, we can talk about that a little bit later. So so this little button here is the Data Studio logo. We click that, gives me the deep link straight to the connector, and we'll give it a go. So it pops up this, which is looking promising. It's telling there's that metadata that was from my manifest file.
Yeah.
We're going to authorize it first because it's the first time we're using this one. So we'll just run through this. It's pretty familiar. We'll allow. And if there was an OAuth component to this, there would be a few more steps in that authorization. Okay, so I think we're ready. So we've got this connect button up here now, so we'll click that. Okay, let me have a quick look. I tried this yesterday and it worked fine. Let me see if I've what have I done wrong?
Is it quite hard to debug connectors?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. You can use the loggers obviously to get your data and that kind of stuff, but sometimes these kind of okay, you know what I'll do is I'll go to the one that I built, because rather than waste any time, we'll see if this one works. So this is exactly the same one, but it's got some comments in now. Yeah, and we'll try this one, and hopefully this one will work. There we go. Okay, so we're now at the same step we would have been if that connect had worked in the previous one. And the first thing you see is then these fields that we defined.
So these are coming from your schema.
Yep. So for example, the timestamp here, it's a duration in seconds. The epoch timestamp in seconds. So if I go back quickly to where that was, so there's that epoch time in seconds. For example, that's the description I've given it.
Yeah.
And so you do a quick check there, okay? And if for some reason you need to make changes, you can change the types and things still here if you want. We'll go to create reports. And the last thing we do is just add this data source to the reports. And now here we are. This is Data Studio now. And what we'll try and do is drag on the geographic map. And this is where we need the drum roll. And let's see if hopefully there we go. So that's
Yeah.
now, we can get rid of that legend. We don't need the legend there. But that's the current position of the International Space Station as of a few seconds ago. So what we'll do, so that's how easy Data Studio is to use. You know, that's its real power, is just being able to do these sorts of things very, very quickly. So actually, if I go back now to the demo, what we'll do is we'll just open up our logger and just take a look at what we've got. So this is what the data, so this is the request that came back from Data Studio. So we asked for the latitude and the position. And then we called the API, which was this one. So the API sent back, this is the format that came back in from the API. So you can see that we have to do a little bit of digging in there because the latitude is inside the ISS position. Then we created this data here, which is what we sent back to Data Studio. So we had that values array of the two numbers, and then that was inside an object, which is inside an array. And so if we had more rows of data, and I'll show you an example in a moment, we would have lots of these values, objects. And then this is the schema that we sent back with it. So we selected the latitude one, and we selected the position one, which was the combination of the latitude and longitude. And then again, actually, there's the, I guess this is the whole data packet that went back to Data Studio with those rows. So this is obviously very, very simple, but this is essentially what's going on with Data Studio. And if we go back now, what we'll do is go and we'll add a little table in here with some different things. So let's get rid of the timestamp and put the date in there, and say the longitude. So this little table here just gives me the longitude and the latitude at the moment for the connector. And if we go back now to the demo, we should see that we have some different. So the request this time had the date, the latitude, and the longitude. We called the API again to get that data, and then these are the values that we returned, and this time it was that date, so 2018, September 21st, and then the latitude, and then the longitude. So, you know, again, the request comes in, and that determines then what your schema looks like and what your data looks like that you send back to Data Studio. Okay, so that's that demo, and what I'll do is jump.
Look all incredibly straightforward.
well, as you can see, it didn't work the first time. I'm not quite sure why.
Probably a missing comma somewhere.
I'm sure, exactly. A comma or something like that. Exactly. Let me jump back to the slides quickly, and then I'll try and show you one more demo just before we finish. So just a few, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just a few things that I wanted to mention that we didn't really see in that easy demo. But the data types can be, so when you're setting up that schema, there's a lot more. There's probably another 4 or 5 piece of information that you can add to each field. So whether it's a default field, whether it has an aggregation that should be specified, whether it has a calculation, default calculation that can be done. So there's a few other things you can add there that are optional. We talked about the authentication. We can use the library. I'll show you the configuration in a minute, these parameters, which is the inputs from the user. That I'll show you an example with that. You can add a template. So if you build the connector and then you go and build a wonderful dashboard report, and you want users to be able to just plug in and use that same report, at least as a starting point, then you can add that template into your connector so that when they use the connector, it opens up with that template loaded for them as well. So that's pretty nice. We saw a little bit of the error handling, and obviously that's something that you need to build into your connectors. When you publish a connector, actually we'll talk about that in the next slide. I've got some of that. It's an app script file, so it's subject to exactly the same quotas as any app script file. So the same that 6-minute or now 30-minute limit on your calculations and things like that. And on that note, then you can do things like use caching to improve the performance, because if you've called the API and got the big dump of data back, and then the user wants to go and just make a change to their charts, then you really don't want to have to go back and call the API again and get all exactly the same data again, and then wrangle through all that data just to send back 2 different fields.
And in terms of quotas, is it the user's quota or the whoever's created the connector? Is it their quota?
It's whoever created the connector, I believe.
Okay.
So the connector would be my connector, sort of, and then the user. So you have to enable link sharing. We'll talk about this in the next slide about how you share it. And then they would effectively just sort of use your file. That's what I believe anyway. Then 2 other things to think about are often the data that comes back from APIs is quite sort of nested data, and that doesn't really just sort of port across straight away into Data Studio. You need Data Studio likes tables that look like Google Sheets tables, which are nice and flat and wide, with lots of columns and everything in rows. So you often have to do quite a bit of data wrangling there to get it flattened and into the right shape for the API from the API for Data Studio. And then one other thing that I've come across that's always adds an extra little challenge there is often there's pagination in APIs, so you have to just be able to loop through them until you get all the data back that you need and keep track of where you are and that kind of thing. But again, it's not, you just have to sort of work that in. So the way you can build them often is to I start often with a Google Sheet and don't worry about the data connector, the Data Studio section first, build the data a Google Sheet version and get the data coming back from the API into Google Sheets just exactly how I want. And then I can sort of take that piece of code and drop it into a Data Studio file. That's sort of the workflow I've been doing. And
that's a nice tip. I can see how a lot of people find that a lot easier to do.
Just because when you have things like that schema in there, and that might be quite long, the files just get quite big quite quickly, and that just makes it seem more complicated than it really is at that stage. So just in terms of the sharing quickly, on the right here we saw the deployment screen, and we saw that I just used the head version, which is obviously your latest code, but you can have a production version which might be one version behind, and then you can have a testing version. So you can make sure that the users are always on a stable version before you go ahead and update them to the most current version. And the other thing you need to do, which I didn't do in my example because it was just me using it, but if anyone else is going to use your connector, you need to make sure that you enable that link sharing, so that anyone can use it. So that's how we share them, and a few best practices then, just to share here. So make sure you do the link sharing, use the caching that we talked about briefly. Don't put any secrets or API keys directly in the script. And you can use the property service if it's your own, or in the example I'll show you in a minute, you can actually just ask the user to input theirs at the connector level. The manifest file is that metadata that's effectively public. So, but that's just like your name, your company name and stuff. So, but again, it's going to be available to people. And then keep those separate deployments of your connector to make sure you can keep manage the versions properly. And then last thing, let me just see if I got time, Martin, just for 5 more minutes to show you this last one. Okay, great. So what I'll do. So this is, can you see that now? It's called copy of page modified. So this is a connector I built earlier this year, that's now on the Google's gallery, and it's a bit like when you submit an add-on. So Steve obviously knows all about this. That Google will then go through that approval process and probably ask you to change a few things, and then eventually, hopefully, they'll say, okay, we'll put it into the gallery now, or in the add-on store. So they have the same process now for these connectors. And so for page modified, we built this one. And the reason I want to show you this particular one is because if you look at my get configuration file now, you can see I have some configuration parameters. So the info is just a parameter that just a piece of text to let the user know some information. Then I have some inputs, 2 input boxes, which is asking for some pieces of information that the user can then input to then go and use this connector. So in this example, it's the connector. I want to see my data from my page modified accounts. So that's why I'm going to enter my API key so that it'll then pull back only my data and not anybody else's data or that kind of thing. So let's give this one a try and we'll see if this one can work for us. So we'll go deploy from manifest. And this is a copy of it, obviously, so don't need to worry about that. So this is what this one looks like, and here's this is what this configuration boxes now look like that we didn't have before.
Okay, yeah.
So you can, there's quite a bit you can do here. Actually, I think you can have like drop-down menus and stuff like that as well if you want. And so what I'll do is I'll put my key in here, and I'll reset this after this. Oops, I'll reset after this show as well. So need to remember that. We'll connect. So we put those pieces of user information in, and we'll connect. And now so you can see there's quite a few more fields in this one. So this schema is a lot bigger. We'll go and create a report. Exactly the same workflow though. We'll add to the reports. And then we will, let's just draw a very simple bar chart. There we go. And so what this one is doing is it's crawling my website and telling me what the responses are from my website.
Mm-hmm.
So I had 1,100 endpoints that came out with 200, a few with 301s, and maybe a few with 404s. So it's for marketers to sort of monitor websites. Anyway, so we'll go back to what I want to show you though is let's go back and look at the data now on this side of things. So it's a little bit more, you can see there's a lot more to it now. But again, we have the request from Data Studio comes in, and this time it has these configuration parameters as well as those fields.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the user configuration parameters, which I now have available to me in my get data function to use to go and call the API with the right API key and things like that. And then these are the fields then that I need. The response code and the name is the two things I've asked for. And then this is what I send back to Data Studio. And each of these values array is a row of data effectively. So this time I have a lot more rows of data than I did in my previous example.
Mm.
And so all of these 200s are getting grouped into that chart and just counted. That's what it's doing in this example.
So Data Studio is doing all the aggregation.
Yeah. And you can, when you're actually in Data Studio, so you see this is where my count of the page URLs is, and I can click that, and maybe I could change it if it was. I think count is the only one that makes sense here because it's strings, but you might be able to change the sum or an average or things like that. And you can change all of your dimensions and metrics here in Data Studio as well. So and so this is one actually that I used some of the libraries here to help me, or some other pieces of code as well to help me with the performance side of things, because sometimes when the data comes back and it's really big, you need to cache it like I talked about. So okay, so that was what I had for you on the demo there. Let me stop sharing screen and just come back. There we go. So
looks well. I've got some questions.
Go for it. Yeah, well, I'm happy to try that. So I'll do my best.
Well, I think it was brilliant. It's I've been aware of Data Studio and connectors for a long time, but I've covered in a very cursory glance. I've not really delved in, but it's really eye-opening in terms of what you can do, and it seems very logical and straightforward to me. But Steve, did you have any questions before I jumped in?
Yeah, I have about 30.
Maybe we'll take it in turns then.
I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but
Ben, you did mention about approval from Google.
Yeah.
So if you make it publicly available, they have to go through the review process again, right?
Yep.
Okay. And then I think you also mentioned, I've seen on the gallery, there are some paid ones.
Yes.
That was going to be my question as well.
Sorry, I took yours. So what's the difference of writing one that's paid and not paid?
Well, so I have not written one that's paid, and I've never written a paid add-on actually. So that's not something I would have be able to sort of speak about. But certainly the one that I showed you there at the end, what the client did was they wanted to add that functionality to their service, so they can take that deep link and just put it on their page, and you can just link straight to it. And the paid ones, I mean, I'm sure I'm guessing it's very similar to the way you would do it with your add-ons, that you would have to add in the payment component, obviously using Stripe or PayPal or something. And
okay,
but that's not something I'm maybe something for a future episode, actually, one day. Yeah.
So just so people know, there's no so you can go to Data Studio and you can see listed community connectors, but a bit like add-ons, there isn't no official kind of monetization marketplace. Everyone's got to kind of bake their own.
Yep, at this stage. And Data Studio is totally free. Building connectors are free because of AppScript. So, you can definitely play around and build your own versions of things if you want. If there's a paid one that exists, you can still go ahead and build your own if you want.
Have you looked at any of the models that people are using for monetization in terms? I guess they're using the input fields that you just talked about just to.
Yeah, I don't know, actually. I haven't looked into the paid ones. I think it's like a bit like the add-on market, and a bit like you said, Martin, there's not really a sort of formal way of doing it. It's a bit of a bake your own. I don't think there's some of the big companies that have been around building add-ons for a long time. Like one example would be, say, Supermetrics have added in connectors for their paid clients. I think it's still pretty hard for you as an individual to just go ahead and build a connector, make it paid, and suddenly start making significant income from that. I think that's quite hard to do. You need volume, obviously, to do that. Yeah.
The other question I was going to ask was, when within the community connector, is it possible? So one of the services in AppScript is the session, so you can get the effective user, get their email address. Do you know if that's possible in community connectors to know who is making a request for the data?
Good question. I don't know the answer to, actually. I mean, you'll have to try it out. And they're standalone AppScript files, so you can do pretty much everything kind of the regular AppScript files, that you would normally do. So, but I don't like to stick my neck out on that one without knowing. The other thing I'll mention is that Google have a lot of examples, probably maybe 10 or 15, maybe 20 even now, of open source connectors that people have built. So one for GitHub, one for Stack Overflow. And so, that's where I learned a lot by just going and looking at how they've done connectors in there. And I know I gave you those 5 building blocks, and it was very simple, that first example. But if you go and look at the ones on GitHub, they look all, they'll all look a little bit different. But if you kind of dig in a little bit, you do find those same building blocks. But the open source ones are good to learn from as well.
That's another good tip. So we'll try and I think I'm inclined to try and pull all your good tips together and share that as part of the show.
Yeah, for sure. I've got all of these links actually bookmarked from just from using them, so I can send you those as well for you to add.
Are there? Steve, before I keep jumping in, you got anything else, Steve, you want to ask?
Yeah, Ben, when I think about dashboards and generally, we can create very cosmetic ones.
Yep.
Sometimes it's good to have a dashboard to say, oh, this one's an anomaly. Maybe it's an error type of thing. It's in red. My question is it possible to click on that to drill down to another dashboard that unpacks the summary into the detail?
So you can't just click on something and it pops open a new chart so you can do that with pivot tables now in Google Sheets. They've just introduced that functionality, and I think that's what you're sort of getting at. But you can, you have tooltips in Data Studio, so it gives you the information of what that particular one is, the data behind it. And you can set up as many, you can have multiple pages in your dashboards if you want to have different levels of granularity or detail. So there's a lot you can do, and they're adding new features all the time. They're listening to users and adding new features. So if something gets upvoted enough, then it'll be added in. I think one of the things they're working on is like an auto refresh, so that you can kind of have them in real time. And there's various other ones actually that are coming along.
So is it difficult to embed these into websites?
No, it's really easy actually. So you can share. It's like a Google Sheet. You can share it directly if you want with someone, or you can get the embed code and drop it into a website. So they're very easy to use, very easy to share, very easy to control whether someone has view access or editing access and that kind of stuff.
Great thing.
Yes, and they're free, and a lot of fun just to play around with it. Even if you're not the least bit interested in the AppScript connector stuff, it's still a good tool because it connects to connects to Google Sheets. So if you have a table of data in Google Sheets and you want to do something a bit more fancy than just the charts in Google Sheets, you can create a dashboard, and you can connect it to your AdWords account, your Google Analytics account, your BigQuery account, or any of these connector ones. So
there's actually a really nice talk at Cloud Next in San Francisco.
I think I know which one you're going to mention.
Alicia, who did natural language processing. So she connected. That was less of a Data Studio connector, but just kind of a very nice example of what you could do with Data Studio. She had some data and sheets, and she kind of wrangled additional data from APIs and put together a very nice dashboard, allowing you to kind of get deep insight into the data.
Yeah, there were some really nice talks actually. Quite a few ones actually at that Google Next. There was one that Minaz Karzai and Philippe Hoffer, I think it was, who did one about BigQuery and Data Studio. Yeah, that was. It's now on YouTube as well as the one from Alicia that was really good as well.
I really like where you mentioned that you can do templates as well. I think that's it. So I'd imagine you just create your example in Data Studio and then just link.
So let me. I didn't have that one right to hand, but you create your template and then effectively just take a piece of that URL there and dump that into your manifest file. And then what that does is at that configuration setting, there's a little checkbox that the user can say, I want to use a template or I don't want to use a template.
Right. Yeah.
And then when it pops open, then all your data is populated into whatever template is that's showing. So that's a really nice feature actually, and that allows people who don't want to build a dashboard, which is not the easiest thing in the world, when you're staring at a blank white screen, to suddenly say, I've got to get insights from this blank white screen. That's still quite a tricky thing to do, even if the UX of the tool is very, very easy. So it's a really nice way for you to just get users up and running immediately, so they can just click through. As you saw, the workflow or the authentication flow for the connector is pretty straightforward. You just kind of go through the clicks, and then if it just pops up a report, then that's a nice thing to see.
Something Steve covered in add-ons a while ago was notifying users of new versions and highlighting what's new in versions. When you push a new version of a Data Studio connector, is there anything the user sees, or do they just they might just see additional?
They would just see any additional functionality maybe that you've put in, but they wouldn't necessarily. It would just be seamless, so that if they popped open that same report they were working on yesterday, it should just keep working the same way, and maybe they'd have an extra field or something if they
needed. How about the config parameter? Wasn't there an info type where you could put in something?
Yep, you could definitely put in that info if you wanted. You could certainly put in some more information there about something if there was something new. I mean, for some people, they might just do that configuration step once to connect, and then for other people, maybe if you're depending on how the connector's set up, you might want to keep going back to that configuration place to put in a different parameters. And actually, what you can do now, what they've done is those parameter boxes, they allow you now to do that input at the Data Studio reports window. So rather than having to go back to that configuration page, because that's a little bit wonky if you're having to keep doing it or you're not particularly technical. So you can now input those parameters at the Data Studio UX level, and they still get sent back with the request the same way they would from the configuration side. So that's something they introduced actually pretty recently, well, maybe 6 months ago. That makes it a bit more convenient.
It seems cleaner. Another question before we end. In the blog post, it mentioned something I haven't looked into. I guess it was cloud data prep.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the phrase garbage in, garbage out. And I think it was suggesting they're using machine learning where possible. Do you have any experience or thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I was at the Google Next conference this year, and I went to one of the sessions, like a hands-on code lab type session about BigQuery and data prep and Data Studio. A really interesting session actually, and data prep it's almost a bit like using BigQuery, like big data in a spreadsheet type environment where you can, it's all kind of in columns, and you can say, I need to split this column into two, or I need to chop off the left 5 characters of this column, or I need to find duplicates and remove them. So the typical data cleaning type stuff you do in a spreadsheet, but applied to a much bigger data scenario. And then what you do is you save all of those steps as little, like macros essentially, so that next time you run your data through this, it just can clean it all for you. And they use the machine learning to try and guess all of the types of cleaning you might want to do, basically based on your data, I think. So, and it's pretty good. It suggests things, and you're like, oh yeah, instead of having to work this out, I can just do a one click and it magically cleans my data. But it's like everything, like you say, Steve, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to keep an eye on everything, and understand why. Make sure your data's complete and clean and all that, and no duplicates and all that kind of stuff before you just rely on these charts that you're then sending back to users, because otherwise you'll be in trouble later, further down the line.
Yeah, because it's always nice to have nice looking visual data, but can I trust it? So that helps through.
Again, that's kind of always on you though, to make sure that you do the due diligence with your data sets, because it's the Data Studio is the fun, sexy part of the analysis bit that you want to spend the time on, creating something that looks pretty, and you sort of neglect all of those data munging, data wrangling formulas at the front end, then you're going to be in trouble.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Well, I'm raring. I'm going to go off and make stuff.
Oh, I look forward to your some blog posts from you, Martin, and your take on it.
Well, yeah, one of my interests is in data from Twitter. So I've been playing around with that for a long time. So and one of the kind of struggles I have is presenting it, and so the idea of being able to create templates for people then to build on really appeals to me. So that's probably changed some of my future plans about some of the stuff I want to be doing.
Well, yeah, definitely set aside an afternoon and see if you can
see
what you can put together.
Well, Ben, that has been a fantastic introduction to Data Studio and Data Studio connectors. So we'll put together as much as we can in terms of links and bits and pieces to help people out. It's nice as well to see, a number of, the app script features that people will be familiar with are there. Which kind of ties into our next show, because as part of that, you mentioned production and development and that kind of life cycle. So our next show is actually on the 5th of October, and we've got Grant Timmerman from Google who will be talking about Clasp and TypeScript and how you can do kind of local development. So again, this could all be integrated into how you develop and deploy your Data Studio connectors. So hopefully, Ben, you'll I think, are you Clasp user as well? Or...
It's on my list of things to just get set
yeah.
up, because I've just developed on my own effectively.
Yeah.
I kind of get, I haven't been proactive probably about setting up the most efficient sort of dev environment, because I haven't really had to in some ways. But I put my stuff on, save stuff on GitHub and use that kind of stuff, Git control, version control and things. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to using Clasp actually. It's a bit wonky the way I do it at the moment. So I will try and I'm going to try and get it set up actually before that webinar, but that'll be a good a good reminder if I don't.
So Ben, you're a consultant and a trainer. So if people are interested in learning more about what you do, we'll include your website, so people can do that. And so hopefully some more people come your way.
Thanks.
Asking questions that interest you. And
yep.
But again, thanks very much, Ben.
Well, thanks very much for letting me talk and having me as a guest. It's a lot of fun. Thank you.
And thank you as well, Steve, for your contributions as well today. Hopefully, we got through most of your questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
If not, I'm sure you'll be in touch with Ben.
Feel free, do. No, thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.